I worked a relief at a Coast Guard auxiliary post on the north shore of Lake Superior for almost 4 years. I quit. The reason I quit is in a banker's box in the back of my hall closet, behind a vacuum I never use. There's a cassette in the box, 11 pages of handwritten long, and one photograph of a boat that, according to every record that I've been able to find, was never built. A few people I respect have asked me, more than once, not to talk about this. I'm going to anyway. I'm 46. I've spent 11 years pretending I imagined a voice I did not imagine, and I'm tired of being the one carrying it. The post wasn't a real Coast Guard station. That distinction matters to me, so I'm going to say it plainly. It was an auxiliary radio relay, one of those leftover wooden buildings the federal government picked up from the old lighthouse service in the 70s and never properly closed. Our job was to cover a dead zone, about 90 miles of water, between two real stations. A vessel in that gap would come through our antenna, and we'd push the signal forward. That was the whole job. Most nights I read paperbacks and drank coffee that tasted like the inside of the can it came out of. I filled out forms nobody ever asked to see. 2 rooms. The front had the console, a folding chair with a bent leg, a kerosene heater we weren't supposed to run but always did, and a window that looked out over water that, at night, didn't look like water. It looked like a hole someone had cut in the world. The back room had a cot, a hot plate, and a metal shelf for the tape archive. There was an old regulation, never updated, that required us to record every transmission on cassette. The tapes got labeled by date and shift and locked in a cabinet. Every quarter, a man named Delaney drove up from the regional office, signed for them, and took them away. I assumed they got bulk erased somewhere. I now know at least one of them did not. My shift partner the first 2 years was a woman named Ruth. She was 63 when I started. Her hand shook a little from a tremor she didn't want to discuss, and she chewed sunflower seeds the whole shift. She'd spit the shells into an empty coffee can next to her chair. That sound, shell on tin, is what my first winter there sounds like in my memory. Ruth had 3 rules. She told me on my first night, and she told me often enough that I can still hear her voice in them. 1. You don't editorialize on the log. You write what you heard, when you heard it, nothing else. 2. If a transmission cuts out, you write the last clear word in the exact second it dropped. 3. If something comes in on the wrong channel, you log it and you do not answer. You let it go. You let someone else's station deal with it. I asked her about the 3rd rule once. She was rolling a seed around in her cheek, looking out at that window. She said sometimes the wrong channel isn't an accident. She said the people on it are not having a good night, and you don't want to be the voice they remember as their last one. I thought it was a strange way to put it. I think now it was the kindest warning anyone ever tried to give me, and I didn't understand it in time. The first 2.5 years were quiet in the way small jobs in remote places are quiet. Fishing boats checking in, cargo vessels cutting across in summer, the ore freighters in the fall, slow as buildings, their engines bleeding bass into the microphone so they sounded like cathedrals when they spoke. 2 distress calls a year, maybe, and always small, always handled upstream before we had to do anything but listen. Ruth retired in the spring of my 3rd year. There wasn't a party. She came in for her last shift, finished her coffee, dumped the shells in the trash instead of leaving the can for me, and shook my hand at the door. She said to call her if I ever needed to talk about anything. I didn't catch how she leaned on the word anything, I caught it later. After Ruth left, I worked alone. They were supposed to send a new partner. They never did. I didn't push. I liked the quiet. I'd bring a thermos, a book, and I'd sit with the static of the channel, which had a particular sound to it, a soft, dry hiss, like wind in tall grass at the end of summer. I came to know that hiss the way you know the rhythm of your own breathing. Any change in it, I noticed. I want to be clear. I was not someone who imagined things. My entire job was to hear what was there and write it down. The first transmission came on a Tuesday in early November. I know it was a Tuesday because I'd been reading a book about a man walking across Iceland, and I'd checked my watch out of habit at 11:27. The hiss broke. There was a click, the kind you get when somebody with cold fingers fumbles the key on a handheld. And then a man, calm. "This is the vessel Margaret Howe, requesting position relay. Over." I picked up the handset. I logged the time. "Margaret Howe, this is relay station 14. Go ahead with your position." He gave me coordinates. I wrote them down, read them back. He confirmed. I asked his destination. 2 harbors. Reasonable. Geography fit. It would put him in our dead zone another 2 hours. I told him I'd relay forward. He thanked me. He sounded tired, not worried. He sounded like any other man who wanted to get to a hot meal and a bed. I pushed the position east. Operator there was a guy I only ever knew as Hollis. He copied. 20 minutes later, the Margaret Howe checked in again. Updated position, consistent with his speed and heading. I logged it, pushed it. Hollis copied. We did this 4 more times across about 90 minutes. It was the most ordinary sequence of transmissions I'd ever handled. He made one small joke about the cold, said his thermos had cracked and he was drinking coffee with ice crystals in it. I laughed because he laughed first. There's a particular camaraderie between 2 people awake at that hour over dark water, and I had it with him for about an hour and a half. At 1:12 in the morning, he keyed open. "Relay, I'm seeing the breakwater. Beginning approach. Thanks for the company." "Margaret Howe, copy. Safe in." He clicked off. 11 seconds later, he keyed open again. "Relay. Relay. This is Margaret Howe. I don't see the harbor anymore." I've spent 11 years trying to describe the change in his voice, and I still can't get it right. He didn't sound afraid. He sounded confused in a small, private way, the way you sound when you reach for your keys and they aren't where you put them. There was no urgency. There was a wrongness to the texture of it, like he'd been talking to me from one room and was suddenly talking to me from a different room and didn't know how he'd got there. "Margaret Howe, confirm your position." He read me a new set of numbers. I wrote them down. I sat looking at them. They weren't the coordinates of a vessel approaching 2 harbors. They were the coordinates of a spot roughly 40 miles north of where he'd just been. Open water, no harbors, no breakwaters, nothing to see. "Margaret Howe, your position doesn't match your previous report. Reconfirm." Same numbers. I asked him what he could see around him. He went quiet for a beat. Then, "I can see lights. I'm approaching a breakwater. I can see the harbor." I told him to hold his position, told him I was going to relay east. I keyed Hollis, gave him the coordinates, asked him to verify on radar if he could. There was a pause on his end. He came back and said the zone wasn't great for him, but no, there shouldn't be a harbor there. There shouldn't be lights there. Was I sure I had the numbers right? I was sure. I went back to the Margaret Howe, asked him to describe the lights. He did. Green to starboard, red to port, small white lights along what he said was a pier. a foghorn. The silhouette of what he assumed was the harbor master's office. He described it the way a man describes a place he's pulled into 1,000 times. And the more detail he gave, the colder I got, because none of it was there. None of it could be there. He was in the middle of the lake. Any other vessels? No. Instruments functional? Yes. I asked him to read his depth. 22 feet, he said. Real depth where his coordinates put him was over 600. I told him that. I told him as carefully as I could that his depth reading could not be correct. That I needed him to stop his approach, drop anchor, and wait. He was quiet a long time. Then he said, "Relay, I'm tied off at the dock. I want you to understand that I followed procedure. I logged the transmission. I noted the inconsistency." I relayed to Hollis. Hollis got hold of the real Coast Guard station at Two Harbors. They confirmed no vessel matching the Margaret Howe had come in or was visible on approach. They sent a man down to the breakwater on foot. He stood out there in the cold for about 15 minutes. He saw nothing. He heard nothing. The harbor was quiet. I keyed the Margaret Howe again. "Confirm you are tied off." "Affirmative, relay. I'm walking up the dock now. There's no one in the office. The lights are on, but there's no one in the office." I asked him to describe what he was seeing. He described an office I'd been inside maybe 20 times. He had the layout right. Calendar on the wall, coffee maker on a side table, logbook on the counter. He mentioned the smell of the kerosene heater. They did run a kerosene heater in that office. I had never said that on the radio. There was no reason I ever would have. I'm not proud of what I asked next. I asked him what the date on the calendar said. He paused. "Relay, the calendar says 1973. I'd like to say I responded like a professional. I didn't. I sat in that folding chair with the handset in my hand, and something very cold moved through me, something I still don't have a name for. And the log later showed I didn't say anything for 41 seconds. I just sat there, and in those 41 seconds, the hiss of the channel sounded different. I know how this is going to sound. It sounded like it was listening. Eventually, I keyed open. "Margaret Howe, please repeat your last." He repeated it. 1973. He sounded mildly amused now, the way you sound when something doesn't add up but isn't worth getting upset about. He figured the harbor master was playing a joke. He said he was going to wait in the office for someone to come. He said his hands were cold and the heater was working and he was going to sit down for a minute. I asked him for his name. He told me. I'm not going to write it here. I'll tell you this. I wrote it on the log, and 3 days later, after I'd filed my report, after Delaney had been up and taken the tape, after a man in a gray suit had told me very firmly that I was not to discuss what had happened with anyone, I drove down to the Duluth Public Library and I looked the name up in the newspaper archive. I found him. Duluth Herald. November 1973. He'd been the captain of a small fishing vessel called the Margaret Howe. The vessel was lost on a Tuesday night in early November. No distress call. The boat just didn't arrive. A search ran for several days. Nothing was recovered. He was survived by a wife and 2 daughters. There was a photo. Square face. Tired eyes. The kind of mustache men wore then. He was 41, and I should go back to the night because I haven't finished telling you. After he told me he was sitting in the harbor master's office, the transmissions kept going for another 2 hours and 17 minutes. He talked to me on and off. He was waiting for somebody to show up, he said. He could hear a foghorn. He thought another boat was coming in. He went out to look. He came back. Dock was empty. Lights still on. Nobody around. His radio was the only thing that seemed to be working, he said, and he was glad I was still there. He said, "Relay, I appreciate the company. It's a strange night. I kept him talking. I asked about his boat, his route, the weather earlier in the day. He answered everything, specifically, consistently, and his answers all referenced a world that did not exist anymore. He talked about a bait shop that burned down in 81. He talked about a bridge that was replaced in 94. He talked about the man who ran the marina, who I happen to know had died of a heart attack in 04. And he talked about him in the present tense, as a friend, as someone he expected to see any minute. At 3:48, the hiss changed, the texture thinned. The pitch came up a little. It was a small shift, and I might not have caught it if I hadn't spent 3 years listening to that particular flavor of silence. He said, "Relay, I'm going to head back out. I think I'm at the wrong harbor." I told him to stay where he was. I told him a boat was coming for him. That was a lie. There was no boat coming, because there was no him. There was no boat. There had not been a him or a boat for 31 years. I told him to stay, because I didn't want him going back out onto whatever water he believed he was on, and I didn't want him to stop talking. Because as long as he was talking, the hiss sounded almost normal. And when the hiss didn't sound normal, I felt watched in a way I do not want to describe and won't. He said, "Relay, I appreciate that, but I think I need to go. My wife is going to worry." "Margaret Howe, please hold position. I'll check in when I clear the breakwater. Thanks again for the company." The click of his handset releasing is the loudest sound I have ever heard. The hiss came back, and it was the wrong hiss. High, thin, and it had a quality I can only call attentive. I know how that sounds. I'm telling you anyway. I sat with the handset in my lap, and I waited for him to check in again. He didn't. I waited until the sun came up. My relief showed up at 7, a guy named Pete. He took one look at me and asked if I'd been crying. I told him I hadn't been. I didn't know until I put my hand on my face that I had. I filed the report. I wrote exactly what I'd heard, with times, coordinates, last clear word. Last clear word was company. I followed Ruth's rules to the letter. I did not editorialize. I gave the report to Delaney when he came up 2 days later with the tape. He took the tape into the back room and shut the door and listened to part of it. When he came out, he was a different color than when he'd gone in. He took the tape and the report and told me I was not to discuss this with anyone. Not my wife, not my friends, not another operator, not Hollis, not anyone. He said someone would be up to talk to me later that week. Someone came, gray suit, polite. He asked me a great many questions in the same even voice for about 2 hours, and at the end he slid a piece of paper across the desk for me to sign. It said I understood the sensitive nature of certain communications anomalies in the Great Lakes region, and that I would not discuss them. I signed it. I wanted to go home. I worked there another 8 months. Nothing happened. The hiss was normal. The transmissions were ordinary. I quit in the summer because I couldn't sit in that folding chair anymore without my hands starting to do what Ruth's had done. And I didn't want to be a person whose hands shook for reasons I wouldn't explain. Before I quit, I did something I shouldn't have. I went into the back room one night when I was alone, and I went to the archive shelf, and I went looking for the tape from that Tuesday in November. It wasn't there. Of course it wasn't there. Delaney had taken it. But behind where it should have been, pushed all the way to the back of the shelf, there was a cassette without a date on it. Just one word written on the label, in pencil, in handwriting I didn't recognize. Company. I took it. I'm not proud of taking it. I took it home and put it in the banker's box, and for 2 years I didn't listen to it. I told myself it was because I didn't have a deck that would handle it. That was a lie. The real reason was that I did not want to know. I listened eventually. I picked up a used cassette deck at an estate sale, and I waited until my wife was visiting her sister, and I sat at the kitchen table with the tape and the deck and a glass of bourbon I didn't drink, and I pressed play. It was a Coast Guard transmission, not from my station. The audio was older, thinner, the way recordings sound when they were made on equipment from before I was born. A relay operator, a captain calling in his approach. They spoke for 9 minutes. The captain described pulling into a harbor, tying off, walking up a dock that wasn't there, an office, a calendar. The calendar, he said, was showing a date 46 years in the future. He read the date. I'm not going to write it down here. I'll tell you, it was 3 weeks after the night I sat in that folding chair and listened to a dead man describe a kerosene heater I had never mentioned over a radio. The relay operator on the recording, a man whose voice I had never heard before, and have not heard since, asked him to confirm. The captain confirmed. The operator asked his name. The captain gave my name. He gave my name. He gave the name of the station I worked at. He gave my call sign. He described me, what I was wearing, the book on the desk, the thermos. He gave it all in the voice of someone standing in a doorway looking at me, and he said it kindly, like someone talking about a friend who'd kept him company on a long, cold night. The relay operator asked him to hold position. The captain said he appreciated that. He said he needed to go. He said someone was going to worry. The tape cuts out before he reaches shore. I've listened to that recording 3 times. The third was 8 years ago. I haven't listened since. I keep the tape in the box because I'm afraid of what happens if I destroy it. And I'm afraid of what happens if I give it to somebody. And I'm afraid of what happens if I play it again. I can't rank those fears anymore. I've stopped trying. I went looking for Ruth about 4 years after I quit. I wanted to ask her what she'd known and when. I drove out to the small town she'd retired to. 1 diner, 1 gas station, a church that used to be a barn, I asked at the diner. The woman behind the counter had known her. She told me Ruth had died the previous winter, peacefully, in her sleep. I asked if I could see the grave. She gave me directions to a cemetery up on a hill. I found the stone, name, dates, 1 line under them. She kept the channel clear. I stood there a long time. The wind off the lake smelled the way it always smells up there, cold iron and pine. I thought about the 3rd rule. I had not followed the 3rd rule. I had responded. I had kept him company. I had asked him his name. I had learned his name, and I had gone and looked it up and confirmed he'd been dead for 3 decades. And I think, though I can't prove it, that in doing so I made myself part of a something. I put my name on a list. I don't know what the list is. I don't know who keeps it. I know that somewhere, on a tape that may or may not still exist, a man dead for over 50 years described me sitting in a folding chair on a night that hadn't happened yet, and he described me warmly, like someone he'd been keeping company with. I'm 46. I work in an office now. I do paperwork that other people actually read. I have a wife and a daughter and a small dog who's afraid of thunder. I don't listen to the radio. I don't own a boat. I haven't been near the lake in 11 years. But sometimes, late at night, when the house has gone quiet and the heat clicks off, and there's that small interval before the next sound, I hear a hiss. It isn't from anywhere. Not the fridge, not the pipes, not the wind in the eaves. It has a particular texture, soft, dry, like wind through tall grass, and it has that quality to it, attentive. It listens for a few seconds, then it stops, and I sit in the dark, and I do not key open, and I do not answer, and I do not give my name. I learned that much. Late, but I learned it. I'm telling you this because I think the tape in my closet isn't the only one. I think there are others. I think there have been others for a long time. I think every quiet relay on every quiet stretch of water has, at some point, had an operator who answered the wrong channel and learned a name they shouldn't have learned. I think Ruth knew. I think Delaney knew. I think the man in the gray suit knew. I think the third rule existed before any of us were born, and I think it was written by somebody who had failed to follow it, and who was trying to spare the next person. If you work a quiet job in a quiet place, and you listen to a quiet channel, and one night something keys open that shouldn't key open, log the time. Log the last clear word. Don't give your name. Don't ask for theirs. Don't keep them company. Let the wrong channel pass. The boat does not reach shore. That's the only true thing about it. The boat does not reach shore, and it never has, and it never will. And the captain knows that, and he is looking for someone to keep him company while he tries to figure out why. Don't be that someone. I was. I can't take it back. I keep the tape in the box because I don't know what else to do with it. And because some nights, I think I hear it playing from inside the closet, even though the deck has been unplugged for years. And because once, last winter, my daughter, who is 7, who's never been told any of this, came into the kitchen in the morning and asked me who their man on the radio was. I asked her what she meant. She said the man who was talking to me last night. She said he sounded nice. She said he said to tell me thank you for the company. I haven't slept well since. I'm telling you because I want it told. Ruth is in the ground. Delaney's retired. The man in the gray suit is whoever he was. None of them are going to tell you. Someone should. The tape cuts out before the boat reaches shore, but the voice doesn't. The voice keeps going. It is still going. And somewhere, on a channel that should be empty, over a stretch of water that should be quiet, a man is sitting in an office that was torn down in 1979, looking at a calendar that hasn't been printed yet, waiting for someone to key open and say hello. Don't key open. That's the end of what I have to say.